Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for Gamma's 5th annual GeoInsurance event. I think every time that we've had this in the past, it's been lashing rain in Dublin, and not to break tradition, it's lashing rain here again today. So par for the course. I'm Richard Garry. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer with Gamma. And our aim, I suppose, with GeoInsurance is to update you on some of the topics related to physical and property risks and perils, I suppose, that might affect pricing and underwriting and the insurance sector in general. Now, obviously, this is a vast subject area covering everything from flood, and we've seen quite a lot of that recently, to wind, storm, subsidence, fire, crime, demographics, rebuild cost, and escape of water. These are, I suppose, only some of the things that might affect these islands. And obviously there's a lot more that affect other parts of the world, like hurricanes and earthquakes, etc. And thank God we don't have those issues here. So while Gamma can provide a lot of these solutions and in these sort of areas, what we'll focus today on is climate change. So we're going to be joined today by 3 speakers: Sabrina Dekker from Dublin City Council, who's going to bring us up to speed on how Dublin City is responding and adapting to climate change, and will do over the coming years. Richard Cantwell will then discuss transition risk, what it is and how it might adapt, or we might have to adapt to some of these aspects because of climate change. And then Charlotte Cuffe will give us an overview of physical risk and how they may change in the years ahead. So just before we start, give you a little bit about Gamma and who we are. Maybe some of you don't know what we do. Gamma is a cloud-hosted solutions provider that integrates software, data, and services to help our clients reduce risk through the use of location intelligence. So what does this mean, I suppose, in practice? What we do is we provide solutions to the insurance sector, and actually more recently to other sectors like banking and lending. And these services include geocoding, so mapping and locating the risk that we're interested in, using building outlines in some cases to identify the actual property extents, and then overlaying things like peril data, like we discussed, so flood, subsidence, crime, fire, climate change, and also building attribute information from our address link product, like the rebuild cost calculator that we discussed. All our data is available through APIs and web services, and can also be visualized within our geo underwriting mapping tool, Peril Finder. Peril Finder allows underwriters to visualize a property, see it on a map and what perils might affect that location, and then generate user-friendly RAG scores, so red, amber, green scores, that the user can then use to interpret that data. And then the results can be output in a PDF report, so it can be stored and then associated with a policy or a document, so that it can be reviewed if there's any questions on the decision and when it was made. Peril Finder also includes the ability to view accumulations and query policy data within the tool, and upload and assess new data. More recently, we have incorporated climate change flood data into the solution to future-proof decision-making. Another solution that we have that's related to climate change is our BEO Wow tool, which allows a householder to see what they should do to retrofit their home to make it warmer and more energy efficient, and also how much it would cost to do that work and what you would get in grants. At the moment, that's available for Ireland, but we'll be launching a UK version towards the end of Q1 24. So back to today. As I mentioned, our first speaker is Sabrina Dekker. Sabrina is the Climate Action Coordinator with Dublin City Council, and will talk to us today about how Dublin City is planning for a climate neutral city. I'll hand over to you there, Sabrina.
Great, thank you, Richard. I hope everybody can hear me, and I'll just share my screen. And hopefully you can see the presentation. We're good?
Yep, you can see that, thanks.
Perfect. So thank you, Richard and Charlotte. Thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. Obviously, my name is not Richard, and Richard Cantwell has kindly offered to let me use his computer here because DCC, we are risk averse to IT issues that might happen, so we have high firewalls. So just going to chat to you about Dublin City Council's Climate Action Plan. So recently we just completed the public consultation for it, which was a response to, there we go, sorry, which is in the context of the Low Carbon Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, Amended Act of 2021, that included Section 16. Have I accidentally lost the screen? Or no, we're okay, sorry. Which required local authorities to produce a climate action plan within 12 months of the minister requesting. So on February 24th, 2023 this year, the minister issued that request and we produced our plan, and it responds to that act, and it looks at how we respond to the national climate objective of reaching 51% reduction in emissions by 2030, how we become resilient to climate change and prepare the city for climate risks, both known and unknown unknowns. So we know that we're facing risks in terms of sea level rise. We are a coastal city. Also flood risk, both fluvial, and groundwater potentially. And as Richard has mentioned, we did experience a lot of that in July and in September, and will most likely continue to experience that through the winter. And that frequency and intensity is going to increase based on the modeling. So this is our plan to prepare for that, as well as the other risks that we often don't talk about, but that we all hopefully enjoy in the summer is heat. But heat does pose a significant risk to both us, the population. So the other critical piece of the Climate Action Plan is it sets out how this is going to be done in a manner that is just and does not cause harm and considers equity. The other piece that we're involved in is Dublin City Council and Cork City Council are both part of the EU mission for 100 and climate neutral and smart cities. So the mission was launched the invitation to apply to the mission was done in 2021. So the objective of the mission is to get 100 cities in the EU to reach climate neutrality by 2030. So that's 20 years ahead of the Irish goal of 2050. The mission though, so we were accepted into the mission in April 2022, along with Cork, and actually the total is 112 cities. There was a lot of people that applied, over 300 cities applied. So Cork and Dublin are the two representatives. And it really is, the mission though is more about, because cities in Europe are home to about 70% of the population, we have the highest emissions footprint both in production and consumption. So the objective is to reduce emissions, but also to prepare for adaptation. So just to mention, there is another mission that DCC and Cork are both part of, the EU adaptation mission. So that is also seeking to innovate and achieve adaptation to resilience to climate change. So the missions really are about trying everything to reduce our risk to climate change. So with that in mind, we've produced our climate action plan, and just, it's a lot of text and I'm sorry for that. This is the vision and mission set out in the climate action plan. It is based on our corporate plan, which is produced between the executive and the councillors of Dublin City Council who are elected. So this vision and mission will change, but I'd just like to highlight the important piece of the mission statement is that we do everything with the health and well-being and quality. Health and well-being is central to that, and quality of life of citizens and communities. So that is the driving piece behind our climate action plan. Most notably, you'll note that our climate action plan is set on 4 foundations. We moved in a different direction to the 5 thematic areas that were in the first plan from 2019 to 2024, which were energy and buildings, transport, flood resilience, nature-based solutions, and resource management. This was done intentionally, partly because climate action requires interdisciplinary approaches and that we work collaboratively together to reduce our risk. So we settled on 4 foundations, the first of which is a resilient city. So under this sets out how we're actually going to address resilience in terms of our social housing. We are the largest landlord in the country. We have 214 flat complexes and over 10,000 houses that we own that we provide as social housing. So we've set out a program of works to reduce energy consumption in those buildings, and we're trying to achieve a retrofit standard of BERB to or cost optimal. Within this, though, we're also looking at how do we make our housing resilient? So we're looking at nature-based solutions and integrating that into social housing complexes because, as I mentioned, heat risk is another challenge. But we also want to make sure that housing is also enables residents of our social housing to live more sustainably and do their bit for the environment. We also own a large number of buildings across the city, so that is looking at how we retrofit. And I'm sure Richard and the team all stare at the civic offices every day and wonder how efficient is that building? The answer is it's not very efficient. So we are looking at how we retrofit that building and reduce the number of leaks that appear on a day like today on the glass blocks. So that building is one that we are looking at. We have done works, we have done LED upgrades, and we're looking at how we reduce water consumption in the building as well. But we do have a lot of work to do around that, as well as there is an opportunity to demonstrate how we retrofit heritage buildings through City Hall and the Mansion House being the most two iconic buildings in the city that represent city government. So those two buildings will also go through that. The other big piece, Dublin is home to significant amount of critical infrastructure that Ireland is dependent on. So we have Ringsend Poolbeg. So the Poolbeg Peninsula is where Uisce Éireann is, as well as ESB and our waste to energy plant. So obviously with the waste to energy plant, we have the Dublin District Heating Project. So expanding, building out that network will be valuable. And that is important in terms of reducing pressure on the electricity grid for heating, as that will provide heat through hot water that will be pumped to homes. So that will increase the resilience of the energy system as a whole. Another piece that often gets missed in this debate, but is actually a point of debate at COP right now, is food. So we have produced a food strategy, Edible Dublin, that is actually looking at how our food system becomes more resilient in a time of climate change. And we often, I think in cities, we forget that we are dependent on agriculture for food. So how do we do our role to support the agriculture sector in Ireland? So the food strategy is based on 4 strands. It's a healthy city, and healthy citizens, growing at home, from farm to fork to back, as well as social enterprises. So how does the food system evolve and become more resilient? That's one. I should mention, these are all interconnected. So a resourceful city, and this is intentional, that anybody who lives in Dublin, you know, one of the great things about Dublin is you can access the sea quite quickly, or you can access the mountain in 30 minutes or less. It is a bit challenging by public transport, but it is possible. But your bike and walking, you can get there quickly. So it's just really keeping that nature in the city and supporting it, because that will help reduce our risk in terms of flood as well as heat risk, and keep the city cool. So it is looking at how do we increase the green cover in the city, and not just in terms of trees, but planting as well, because this is about biodiversity and how do we support biodiversity. One, obviously, that is of interest to yourself is restoring the city's rivers. We have a number of them. The city is defined by 5, and we often forget about the Poddle. But in this climate action plan, the 2 that we highlight are the river restoration project for the Santry, as well as the Kamek. So that Santry project is ongoing, and it is looking at how we actually create buffer zones. And actually, it also is about including recreation opportunities for young people, and also drawing attention to the wildlife that's there and everything that's around the river. We're also looking at, because resources are not just about nature here in this context, it's also about the buildings that we have. We are in a housing crisis, so one of the things that we're looking at is the adaptive reuse of buildings and how we can convert abandoned commercial buildings into social housing, so or into potentially other spaces. I know we recently hosted the United Cities Local Government Conference on Culture, so how do we actually make spaces for creatives? And then the other piece that we've just completed is a bit of research with Belfast City Council around circular economy. So that is another shift in our system to make it more resilient, but also to support that. So obviously we went with a creative city as well, because the other thing we recognize is that this is interdisciplinary. So our libraries have maker spaces that we're introducing. We're also looking at how do we partner better with academia in creating networks for knowledge exchange. I think the other thing that, and again, going back to that health and well-being and citizens, we have a large number of students, and that's a large number of ideas, and we want to bring young people into the public sector. So one way of doing that is strengthening our partnerships with academia. Right now, we do have a partnership that we have students that come from DCU and intern with us, but we also feed into using DCU's Masters in Climate Change, looking at we provide capstone projects, so students can come work with us during one of their final years on a problem that we face. and come up with a solution for us. So trying to build out those opportunities to partner with academia, not just for applications for EU funding, but how do we work with students so that they get real world experience and understand how local government works. The other piece to this is innovation districts. So how do we work with businesses like yourselves, and find innovative solutions that respond to the climate crisis, and as well as improve quality of life. The other last one here is decarbonization zones. This is a requirement under the Climate Action Plan at the national level. So we have picked Ballymun and Ringsend. And again, Ringsend is intentional because of the large amount of critical infrastructure. The idea with this is similar to the mission, is that we test everything that we can and use these as opportunities to trial everything to get to zero. It is an ongoing process. So it's kind of a watch this space. We'll see where they go. They really have to be community-led for these ones. The final piece is a social city. So anybody coming in from the north side of the city is probably enjoying the high amounts of construction that we have for the Clontarf City Centre cycle route. The reason we did this as a social city is we recognize that people need to move through the city. People need to go have the chats with their friends. They need to get to work. They need to drop their kids to school. So it's really about how do we get them to move efficiently and quickly, walking or cycling or scootering, or accessibility if you're in a wheelchair. How do you move around? So the connected travel network, so the goal here is to have 95% of the population within 400 meters of the active travel network. It is also about making neighborhoods the heart. It's often said that Dublin is a city of villages, but also linking back to the other actions around resourcefulness is people need to be able to live and do the things that they want within 15 minutes. So should you be able to repair your shoes, you should be able to do that walking out your door. You should be able to go get your bike repaired quite quickly. So it's thinking about how people's needs can be met quite quickly and doing that. This was a bit of a last minute addition, but something that we actually thought about is our play strategy has an element of climate in there as well. And that's about cool spaces, but green spaces. Like, we do want people to be in our parks and enjoying them because they're connecting with nature and learning about the biodiversity in the parks. So in our previous climate action plan, we kind of advertised that the native tree trails program. So in 54 of our parks, you can actually learn about what trees are native to Ireland, and it's a great way to spend an afternoon with your children. So you still can download that from our website. But it's that idea of, like, if people are using our parks and they're enjoying themselves, we're increasing social connectivity and social cohesion. And people know their neighbors, which is important in the context of an emergency, that you know who's there, who's missing. So that's a key bit there. It's also, you don't use energy at home. So if you're able to enjoy a park, you're doing activities that are good for your health. This is a big one. People probably mostly think of public realm as the big plan of College Green. This is a little bit more than that. This is looking at public spaces, the road outside your house. How do we change that? How do we change our relationship with this? And what do we do? So we want those spaces to be more green, less cars, because that increases safety for everybody using the road. But also, one thing we're looking at is, and linking it back to the critical infrastructure where I was mentioning our social housing, is how do we change the public realm in our social housing complexes as well? So one project that we have is climate resilient housing on Dominic Street. That is going to include elements of retrofit, but also how do we change the public space there to actually reduce water runoff, but also provide a space for people to gather and enjoy the space there. Obviously, the biggest, forgot I had put that little thing on there. That hurt my ears. I hope it didn't hurt yours. The challenge for us is implementing the climate action plan. And as I mentioned, we're part of an EU mission. So we are going to have to collaborate with a lot of people. And the reason I have cupcakes here, and you're going to wonder why this has anything to do with climate action, is we have all the ingredients to make the difference. And I think one of the things we often forget in implementing policy is that if you just stick how many different options you can create by just bringing together flour, water, eggs, and sugar, you can come up with cupcakes, you can come up with pancakes, you can come up with bread. So the challenge for us is taking the existing tools that we have and coming up with new ways of bringing those together and delivering on climate action. And one of the things we need to do is work collaboratively with everyone, not just internally, but with other stakeholders like yourselves. So I do hope that you express an interest in our climate action plan, and always kind of feel free to email us and chat and just meet with us to learn about what we're doing, but also maybe we can come up with ideas for other things to do. And I think that is my last slide. Just thank you. And I'll hand it back over to Richard here. Just do a quick screen off so you don't see our change.
That's great. Thanks for that, Sabrina. So yeah, look, I think that was quite interesting. It's always good to have something quite local and see how things are affecting my hometown anyway. So our next speaker is Richard Cantwell. He is our head of spatial analytics here at Gamma. Richard's a very keen geographer. His work with us centers on the application of spatial data to various market challenges, and particularly in the area of climate change. So in Richard's talk today, we're going to focus on transition risk. So he's going to explain what it is, why it's important, and how and why it can be measured and reported on. So perfect timing there, Richard. If you're ready to go, I can hand it over to you. If you can share that, share your deck.
Okay, just putting it on screen there now. Hopefully you can see it all. Perfect.
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so yeah, I'm talking here today about the measuring, monitoring, and managing of transition risk, which is, I suppose, one of the key risk sectors that our clients are facing. I suppose we can sort of divide risks into two main classes, physical and transition risks. Now, Charlotte is going to come along after me now and talk a bit more about the physical risks, which might be more familiar. Obviously, climate change is impacting the risk of all sorts of events, everything from increasing storm intensity, increasing the risk of flooding, anything that's going to affect claims. Drier periods could increase subsidence claims and so on and so forth. And we'll hear more about that shortly. But one consideration here also is that properties themselves are increasing the risk of climate change. Something like 36% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union come from buildings. And we just heard there from Sabrina that there's plans afoot to address the large buildings in Dublin City owned by the City Council, and of course the housing as well. But the insurance sector needs to be aware of the risks from both an underwriting perspective and on the property investment side of the business as well. And then there's a lot of regulatory changes and regulation in this space. So yeah, I mean, typically on the physical risk side, you're looking at the total value of risks and losses versus expected losses. But on the transition side, it tends to be more of a focus on greenhouse gas emissions from your portfolio. So one of the key things in the whole area around transitional risk is the types of risk out there in this. And there's been a report from, again, the whole area is sort of chock full of acronyms, but the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has set out various risk sectors, the policy and legal risks, which leads to things like increased emissions pricing, emissions reporting requirements, litigation exposure, and increased regulation. But also on the technology side, substitution, you might end up with stranded risks where if investing in certain classes of energy production may become stranded assets because the price for solar has just completely priced these things out of the markets, and there's a move away. But there's also risks around investing in certain classes of infrastructure that require new technologies which may not be successful, and just transitioning away from high to low emissions technology has there are costs associated with that. And then you also need to consider the things in the market. The market is changing, customer behavior is changing, raw materials costs are changing. The price of cobalt is gone very high because they're a key component in lithium batteries. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market signals out there where previously understood market metrics no longer apply. And then it's a whole area around reputation because customer preferences are changing. There can be stigmatization around investments in heavily polluting assets. There's a lot of concern and feedback from stakeholders. So this TCFD report is probably one of the key documents in this space. But there are more coming down the tracks, including a task force on nature-related climate exposures, a TNFD, and talk more about that shortly. But in the area around transition, the key measure though is emissions. And there are a range of regulations, reporting frameworks, ratings, and indices that cover this. So, two of the key ones are the EU taxonomy regulation, which is a key framework. Ideally, what it's doing is setting a common language that can be used to classify activities, including investments. And the companies have to report on how their activities are covered by the taxonomy and how compliant they are. And that's entered into force in July 2020. At the beginning of this year, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, entered into force. And that requires that large listed organizations on the various stock exchanges and so on around the world have to start reporting from financial year 2024. So starting this January, they're going to have to report on sustainability issues, financial risks and opportunities arising from climate change, and the impact of the companies on the people and the environment to their investors and stakeholders. That applies to large listed organizations starting from financial year 2024, smaller organizations from financial year 2025, and by 2026, every organization that is listed as an investment class will need to be reporting across all of the stock exchanges in Europe. Now, there are some opt-outs around that. You may be able to get a year or two an extension on it, but that's a huge amount of additional reporting requirements. When it comes to the CSRD, sustainability is the key measuring here, and it's both inside out and outside in. And what we're sometimes referred to as dual materiality. And what that means is the inside out is, how is this asset or our company, this investment, impacting on the environment? And then outside in is, how is the environment going to impact on this asset or our company, this investment? This really, it's concerned around the different scopes that the emissions can fall under. Sometimes referred to as what you burn, what you buy, and what's beyond that. So scope 1 is the emissions that the company generates as part of its activities. So, the company running its facilities, company vehicles, and so on. Scope 2, any energy that you purchase, indirect emissions, and purchase heating and cooling, purchase energy, and so on. And everything beyond that then can be either upstream or downstream in terms of the company's activities. And that's going to include employee commuting, but also investments, leases, asset classes management, and so on. That's scope 3. So, for the financial sector, really, you're looking at the investments. They fall under scope 3, so they do need to be actively monitored and considered. And you can see this in annual reports from large organizations. I've just picked out 2 here, but if you go through any large asset holder, I picked out Aviva and AXA here, started towards the beginning of the alphabet, and you can see that they are reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3 across their business activities. And now this is being driven by the CSRD, which is why they're having to report on this. And of course, there's going to be changes now with additional disclosures required in the future. So there's a lot of agencies and task forces and government bodies and international organizations trying to create standardized approaches and ways to measure and report climate change. The one that we found useful is the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF. They've produced a number of reports related to different emissions from different kinds of companies in the financial sector. And financed emissions, which is relating to investments, insurance associated, part C, which was the second report to come out, which allows you or shows you formulae or methodologies for insurance companies to attribute part of the emissions from their assets that they are underwriting. And then finally, the facilitated demolitions, Part B, which actually was only published Friday of last week, 1st of December. But yeah, ultimately, it's about how much of the emissions of an insured asset should be attributed to the insurance company. Now, all of these reports are quite detailed, but it would certainly, I think, if you're working in this area, even the executive summaries are definitely worth a read. So looking at just domestic property initially, if you're looking at, a lot of our clients are working in the property sector. 10% of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions in 2022 came from domestic properties, 6.1 million tonnes. If we adhere to our climate action plan, that needs to decrease by 47% by 2030, which is a huge ask. And that requires, and again, it was the kind of work that Sabrina was mentioning that Dublin City Council are undertaking, a lot of retrofits, heat pumps, district heating, like that scheme in Ringsend and maybe others in the west of Dublin. And ultimately targeting about 500,000 upgrades to BE or B2 by 2030. Now, if you consider that the total housing stock in Ireland is 2 million buildings, that's a quarter of the buildings in the entire country have to be at least BE or B2 by 2030. And at current rates, that's unlikely to be made. So it's going to require significant assessments, investment in that sector, including grant aid from the government. And ultimately, as a financial institution, if you're insuring, mortgaging, or investing in the property, you bear some responsibility for enabling those emissions. We can model this, though. I mean, do you know the emissions of your mortgage book or your investment portfolio? I mean, there's a lot of data available from things like BEO certs or EPCs, as they're called elsewhere. And where there are gaps, there are models, typically built using AI or machine learning, but mostly it's regression, to be honest, to estimate properties' EPC ratings, so we can fill gaps where there are buildings that don't have ratings. And it can, various levels of reporting that we can do. But these models are trained on a set of properties where the answer is known, and the input variables are things such as roof and heating type, the area of the building, its location, how many windows it has, what's the U value on those windows, and so on. And once the model is trained, it can be used to estimate the emissions from properties that don't have a BEO search, which means you can rate an entire book. And then you can score the data that you're reporting on or ingesting based on the quality of that. And again, the PCAF reports give guidance on how to go about doing that. But typically, there's quite a lot of work done actually in Ireland and internationally on energy use from the current building stock. One example is BEO Wow, for example, which is a company that has been set up to enable or facilitate building retrofits. And that modeling, they basically identified about 50 building typologies in Ireland. Other countries would have different numbers. But you can model the EPC or BEO rating of a building quite accurately if you know its year of construction, if you know its built form, if you know its location and spatial context, and things like also the building footprint or the number of stories. So you can lots of different typologies of Irish buildings out there, and then we can kind of hit them pretty accurately once we know those key attributes. There's also a lot of local spatial statistics where BEO ratings available for example, small areas. And this can be, so ultimately taking all of that together, it can be used to suggest retrofit options, which is what BEO does. But it could also be used to model the emissions of the entire building stock, or any selection from that, such as a book of business. But there's a lot of other things going on in the entire space. One relatively new thing is in the satellite space. I mean, this is a fairly low resolution taken from Landsat imagery. But it's looking at heat islands, and you can see around the map that there are some areas which are in darker red, which have got more of a heat island effect going on. In the southwest of the image there's a lot of patchy reds down there. That's a very industrial area of Dublin, and there's some buildings around there which perhaps have a large heat island effect, perhaps It's not suggesting that that it's entirely down to heat loss in the building itself, but there may be some rationale behind looking at some of the buildings in that area. There's also a peak kind of standing out in the northeast, which when you zoom in on it, is actually a chocolate factory. Maybe they should invest a little bit in heat recovery, who knows. Now there's much higher resolution data than this becoming available. There was one provider just launched a satellite this summer, which has got 3.5 meter resolution, rather than this is, I think, around about 100 meters or so. But the likelihood that 3.5 meter resolution data is going to be extremely expensive. We'll wait and see. So lots of new data sources and things coming down the lines in that space. But of course, commercial property is another. I mean, whatever about residential, it can be a different story. It can be much more difficult to model. The building typologies don't really apply. Now, while it is a smaller contributor to building emissions than the domestic sector, it is still significant. But it's very difficult to use models to fill in gaps, or it's more difficult rather. The business estimates instead of asset is only often possible. You can do some modeling based on similar buildings and similar sectors, activities, business categorization data based on SIC codes or NACE code related averages. And of course, there are commercial bodies out there like the ratings agencies, which can provide data in this space too. And again, the PCAF does, give some guidance on how you might use data scores in this to estimate the full gaps. So, if you're looking at property, there's a whole set of targets related to new builds, renovating, buying property that could affect an insurer. New builds are required to be much more efficient than existing properties. There's increasing pressure from legislation and desire from householders to avail of grants and finance available to retrofit properties, kind of a stick and carrot approach. And for the insurer, this means a lot of potential changes to the risk profile of buildings which you're looking to underwrite, as, for example, fuel types used to heat the space can change. Maybe people moving away from solid fuel to heat pumps. What does that do to the risk profile of the building? Perhaps that reduces the risk of a fire at the property. Are there risks associated with solar panels? Storm damage might be significantly higher in buildings that have solar panels installed. The profile and the material used in construction can change. It's moving away from concrete, because obviously cement produces huge amounts of CO2, to timber frame housing. But what are the safety considerations and risk profiles associated with doing that? What we're looking at here, for example, is the EU taxonomy compliance for property, and you can see that for constructing new buildings, they need to be of a certain primary energy demand. When you're acquiring or owning a building, if the building is built before December 2020, it should have at least EPC Class A, which in the Irish context was extremely onerous because there's only a tiny proportion of our buildings of Class A at present. Then they kind of relaxed the requirement slightly to be within the top 15% of the national building stock, which in Ireland equates to a B2 rating. So that explains why our climate action plan targets are 500,000 buildings, because that's the B2 rating equates to that in Ireland climate action plan. But there's also energy emissions, not the only thing that need to be considered when you're constructing and operating buildings according to the taxonomy. There's a lot of limits around water usage, limits around the recycling rate for construction and demolition waste when the asset is being built, standardized measures for the pollutants and dust, and also restrictions on land types that can be built on. So that's the kind of coming from the EU taxonomy and the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. But I did mention that there's additional organizations or additional kind of standard settings going on out there from task forces, and then one of them that's just again published a report at the beginning of September, is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, where the organisations need to disclose their impact on nature. They need to describe the effect of nature-related dependencies, impact, risks, and opportunities that have on the organisation's business model. Describe the process for how they're going to assess this, and set targets and disclose the metrics, and report on them. And again, of course, this has a key spatial element. Looking at the sensitive locations where the activities in the organization's direct operations, and also up and downstream in the value chain, interface with nature in areas deemed to be ecologically sensitive. So again, this is going to require build up of data sets that kind of allow people to assess this. And I've looked at a couple of examples just in the Irish context over the last number of months. We have here, for example, this is a map of terrestrial biodiversity. So the darker the green, the more diverse the area is. So if you are considering investing in a new housing estate or in existing properties, they need to be, if they are in these highly biodiverse areas, that needs to be something that should be addressed. And it's not just biodiversity, it's also water. We can see the water quality, certainly around the Dublin region, but also around other parts of the country, tends to be quite poor. The reds and the oranges on there are poor scores on water quality. When you get into the greens and blues, it's a bit better. And the river catchments are a key building block for a lot of this. So, what we're trying to do is, bring all of this together, build out dashboards and models that will allow for monitoring this, reporting on it, and integrating it into business processes. But there are a whole set of challenges relating to this. I mean, there is an evolving regulatory landscape. There's new task forces that produce additional reports. There's new requirements and so on. What to measure, monitor, and report? What data is available to support this? And then also, once you have the data to do the measuring, monitoring, and reporting, how do I operationalize that? How do I take it from the raw data that you can come in from a range of sources and put that in front of the end user who's making decisions or having to do the reporting, and so that they can do this in a reasonable way? And that requires a whole lot of things to go on under the hood relating to data management, everything from data updates, data storage, moving data around systems. We usually refer to that as ETL, or extract, transform, load. There's a whole bunch of different technologies to support this, but it's a big data management exercise. There's also a whole set of regulations and requirements that relate to just data itself, as distinct from the impact it has. And the typical one here is GDPR. There are restrictions, for example, around getting BER data at individual household level, because it's the organisation which produces that data regards it as personal data, so it won't release that data. So this requires additional modelling to be done. And of course, as I mentioned just there are additional data requirements coming down the track from things like the TNFD. And there is no doubt that as this whole ESG space continues to evolve, we will see more requirements coming from that. So that's me. Thanks very much, everybody. If you do need to contact me, my email address is on the screen there. And with that, I will hand back to Richard. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Richard, for that. Just I suppose one question on the TNFD, which is all quite new. Is there any timings around that in terms of reporting requirements for organizations, or is it too new at this stage?
I think it's still too new. It hasn't been written into anything yet. So it's kind of at if you look at the TCFD, that came out in 2017. And a lot of the recommendations from that are only getting implemented from kind of 21 on. So the kind of first report of the TNFD was just released there in September. So it's likely to be a couple of years away. But I suppose one of the key challenges there is that, getting ready, because, you can't, you need to hit the ground running when those regulations come in. So better to start early.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that makes sense. Thanks, Richard. So our final speaker is Charlotte Cuffe. Charlotte's been with Gamma for 7 or 8 years, I think, at this stage. She's primarily focused on property data, machine learning, and predictive modeling, and is going to talk about physical risk as it relates to climate change and property features, and about the statistical models that can help to manage that risk. So Charlotte, I'll hand over to you at this stage. You want to share your screen?
Thank you, Richard. Share now. Okay. Hi, everybody. As Richard mentioned, I'll be talking about the physical risk aspect of climate change. So we've heard lots about transitional risk, and we've heard interesting things about changes that can be made to manage the transitional risk and the physical risk. So what I'll be talking about is the risks that the buildings face as a result of the environment that they're in and as a result of climate change. So this table comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it shows the trends in the change of the climate in Northern Europe, which includes Ireland. Overall, the high level is warmer, wetter, and more variable. So we're looking at fewer droughts, but more heat, less wind, but more wind storms, and just generally more water everywhere, be that rainfall, river flooding, coastal flooding, sea level rise. So first of all, we're looking at more hot weather, but fewer droughts. Now that mainly relates to the risk of wildfire, and Ireland's risk of wildfire is quite low, especially compared with Southern Europe. But heat and dryness are not the only contributors. There's also several other factors that affect the risk of wildfire, including the aspect of the slope and how steep it is, because fire likes to run uphill, the type of land cover and land use. So land cover refers to, is it pavement, is it vegetation, is it a pine forest, whereas land use is whether it's being used for human activities, is it rural, urban. And land use is particularly interesting because fires in the remote wooded areas tend to do more damage. They tend to extend over a bigger area before they're brought under control, whereas fires in the rural-urban interface, they're more frequent. They tend to be controlled faster because they're noticed faster, but they have more potential to cause injuries or property damage. The next thing to look at is wind speed, which, as I've just mentioned, does affect the spread of wildfire as it fans the flames. But we're looking at having less wind overall, so that's bad news for the wind farms. But when there is a storm, it's likely to be more severe, do more damage, so that's also bad news. That satellite picture is from Storm Ophelia in 2017, approaching from the southeast, ready to whip up the Atlantic coast, and the Atlantic coast is the windiest part of the country. There are exposed pockets in other areas too. You can see there's the Wicklow Mountains is very prone to wind. So we can expect wind forms of the Ophelia type to become more frequent. This is basically because there's more energy being dropped into the atmosphere with more heat, and that energy has to go somewhere, and it turns into wind. The next issue, of course, is rain, flood. So we're looking at more rain and more frequent fluvial and pluvial flooding, and also more severe flood events when they happen. So it's both parts, the frequency and the severity. So severity in turn means two things. It means the extent of the floodwater and also the depth of the floodwater. So this shows the flood extents over a 75-year return period around the river. And this is over a 1,000-year return period, so a less frequent event, less probable, but covering a wider extent than the 75-year flood. And in the areas that are close to the river, they're affected by increased depth, which translates to more property damage. So with the increasing precipitation, we're looking at a situation where the rare events like this become more frequent and do more damage and do it to more properties. So this example shows the baseline flood risk as it is now for an area of Bristol. You can see that address is highlighted and it's currently no risk. By 2030, that's turned into low risk. By 2050, it's gone up to medium risk, and there are many more properties that have any level of risk. And then by 2080, that address has gone from none to high risk. There's lots of red, lots of amber, and there's very little left in the no risk category. So that is the trajectory that we're looking at. Then another peril that's affected by rainfall is subsidence. In areas where the bedrock has a high proportion of water-soluble minerals, certain types of limestone, for example, these can be literally washed away over time. So the bedrock under your house that was lovely and solid when you built it, over time can become more and more fragile until you're dealing with a catastrophic and sudden collapse. And so the other watery trend is for higher sea level and more coastal flooding. Now, as an island, of course, that's got to be an issue for us, and our biggest cities tend to be located on the coast. So as a country, we're quite vulnerable to events at the coastline, whether that's erosion or sea level rise or coastal flooding. So this shows the effect of adding 1 metre to the sea level and 75 metres to the depth of coastal flooding in a 100-year event. So we're saying, what if the coastal flood event is higher than it's formerly been, and it's also happening on top of a higher sea level? So the map on the left there shows the heights of the flood. So in the southeast, it's looking at 3 metres and as much as 6 metres on parts of the Atlantic coast. And then we map that against a digital terrain model, which tells you the height of the land at each point and the average flood size claim in order to come up with an estimate of the total value at risk from this sea level rise issue. And as you can see, it is considerable across both residential and commercial. And so far then we've talked about the perils themselves, what's happening in the environment and what it can do to buildings. But then what about when the event happens, if it happens? Can we say anything about which properties are particularly vulnerable or which properties are likely to be more difficult or more expensive to remediate if the event should happen? So one obvious issue is basements. Any house with a basement effectively starts below ground level. So from the point of view of that house, the ground level is lower than you'd expect if you look at the street outside. So clearly that's a flood risk. Now, basements are an uncommon feature of Irish architecture. They don't tend to be in every house, but they are not non-existent. There are basements scattered all around the country, including some along the coast. Like this terrace on the seafront in Bray, it's literally across the road from the sea. So you can imagine if the sea were 1 metre higher, you might start to feel a little bit concerned living in one of those, even before you get to the storm surges or coastal flooding. Another concern is the cost of rebuilding. We've seen significant inflation in the building sector, so rebuilds are costing more than they did before just by the nature of the materials and the labour costing more. And the standard rebuild cost estimates, so it varies by region, but it mainly comes down to the size of the building and is based on a standardised average cost per square metre. But there are some homes that would actually cost much more than average to rebuild as a result of having a complicated or an unusual construction. So for example, here in Dublin 18, you can see on the right, there's some streets of quite standard uniform looking buildings. Then on the left, I've highlighted them in orange, a couple of slightly unusual structures. And then over to the far left, highlighted in red, is this very unusual kind of C shape, to which you just could not apply the standard square meters multiplied by cost per square meter. So overall, we can expect climate change to have a big impact on the risk to property. But the good news is there is data and there are models that can help to monitor and manage the exposure to risk. So here's just a very quick overview of some that you might already know about or some that you might not have encountered. So there's a model in development for the wildfire risk. There are sources on the risk of windstorm. Will it happen? How much damage might it do? Flooding, again, is well covered, pluvial, fluvial and coastal flooding. There are models for the risk of subsidence. Luckily, it's quite rare, but when it happens, you want to know. There are models as well for rebuild cost, for the complexity of a building affecting the rebuild cost, and a model in development for whether it's likely that there is a basement. So there are data sources to help manage the risk. So that's everything from me. I'll hand back over to Richard.
Lovely, thanks for that, Charlotte. I suppose just one question, probably for myself as well. In relation to the basements and the wildfire models, you're working on those at the moment. When do we expect those to be, I suppose, available to test for some of our clients?
Yeah, so they are in the pipeline, and we should have news to share on those in early 2024.
Okay, excellent. Grand. Look, I don't think we have too many more questions coming in, actually. I suppose it's really just left to wrap up at this point. So I would like to thank Charlotte, Sabrina, and Richard for their time. I think there's loads to consider in that. Also like to thank Julie in the background, our new marketing manager, who's been busy organising GeoInsurance for us. Also like to thank everybody for attending today. I hope you found it of interest. If you have any questions, my details are on the screen. I think there's a lot we've covered today. We've only really skimmed the surface of some of these. If you'd like to explore them in more detail, certainly get in touch, and I can organise further discussions with Charlotte, Sabrina, or Richard, or anyone else that you would like to explore in more detail. So thanks again, and I think we will wrap it up there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.